Question 89 of Prima Secunda in the Summa Theologia brings us to an end of the treatise on evil habits, vices, and sins. And then we'll be going into the treatise on law next, which is really awesome. And so as we talk about venial sin, it's just good to have a little bit of a refresher in that there is an order that God has established in his relationship between us, ourselves, our fellow man, and God. And we're naturally good. We have a natural aptitude for virtue, but we're also humans, and there's a lot of good things in the world to which we can be attracted to inordinately. And Adam and Eve, in the state of original justice, were given a extra grace, a super grace that allowed them to have complete ordinatedness between their reason and their passions, which was lost with original sin, and now we have what's called concupiscence. And so we have a tendency to be drawn inordinately to mutable goods, the goods of the world, food and sex and sleep and that kind of stuff. And so that's the problem. And so if we are inordinately drawn to it, it'll be a venial sin. And if it's so much that we cut off ourselves from the immutable good, which is God, then it is a mortal sin. So these 6 articles are about venial sin. He has some very interesting questions about that, having to do with the angels and Adam and Eve and children who are only baptized, who have not been baptized yet, but only have original sin. Can they commit venial sin? So really interesting where St. Thomas Aquinas' mind goes with this. Article 1, whether venial sin causes a stain on the soul. And I'll just kind of summarize this one. He's going to say no, because a stain in the soul comes principally from mortal sin. He says a stain denotes something permanent in the thing stained, wherefore it seems in the nature of a loss of habitual rather than of actual comeliness. Therefore, properly speaking, venial sin does not cause a stain in the soul. Article 2, whether venial sins are suitably designed as wood, hay, and stubble. This is kind of interesting, and this is from a quote in Scripture, which I believe comes from Galatians. Let's see. He says, some have understood the foundation to be dead faith, upon which some build good works signified by gold, silver, and precious stones. Now that would be the opposite of wood, hay, and stubble, while others build mortal sins, which according to them are designated by wood, hay, and stubble. Okay, so some people think that these refer to mortal sins. He says Augustine disapproves of this explanation, as the Apostle Paul says in Galatians 5:21, he who does the works of the flesh shall not obtain the kingdom of God, which signifies to be saved, whereas the Apostle says that he who builds wood, hay, and stubble shall be saved, and yet as by fire. And this, by the way, is a reference to purgatory. So if we die with only venial sins or inordinate attractions, on us, then we will spend time in purgatory, but we won't go to hell. Okay, hell is if we've entirely cut ourselves off from charity and the grace of God. Others say that wood, hay, stubble designate good works which are indeed built upon the spiritual edifice but are mixed with venial sins, as when a man is charged with the care of a family, which is a good thing, excessive love of his wife or of his children or of his possessions insinuates itself into his life under God, however, so that, to wit, for the sake of these things, he would be unwilling to do anything in opposition to God. Ultimately, he says, no, that's not it either. He says, for it is evident that all good works are referred to the love of God and one's neighbor, wherefore they are designated by gold, silver, and precious stones. Okay, so still that this man had, the good relatively aligned. So finally, he says, we must therefore say that the very venial sins that insinuate themselves into those who have a care of earthly things are designated by wood, hay, and stubble. For just as these are stored in a house without belonging to the substance of the house, and can be burnt while the house is saved, so also venial sins are multiplied in a man while the spiritual edifice remains, and for them man suffers fire either of temporal trials in this life or of purgatory after this life, and yet he is saved forever. Okay, so he's saying, yeah, this basically refers to venial sins, and that comparison, that analogy, I think kind of works. It's quite nice. Whether a man could commit a venial sin in the state of innocence. Now, by this, he means Adam and Eve in a state of innocence, in that original justice, right? And it's an interesting question, right? But let's see, should I? Yeah, I guess I will read this in its entirety. It is generally admitted that a man could not commit a venial sin in the state of innocence. This, however, is not to be understood as though on account of the perfection of this state, the sin which is venial for us would have been mortal for him if he had committed it, because the dignity of a person is circumstance that aggravates a sin, but it does not transfer to another species. Remember, there's an entirely different species of, between the mortal sin and the venial sin, because one is a whole lot worse than the other. Unless there be an added deformity by reason of disobedience or vow or the like, which does not apply to the question in point. Consequently, what is venial in itself could not be changed into mortal by reason of the excellence of the original state. Okay, so he's going to say here in the next paragraph that the Adam and Eve could only sin mortally, which of course they did. They had an inordinateness, a integrity between their reason and their passions, which was because of that superabundant grace that they were given. Okay, so he says the reason of this is because venial sin occurs in us even either through the imperfection of the act, as in the case of a sudden movement, or in a genus of mortal sin, or through some inordinateness in respect of things referred to the end, the due order of the end being safeguarded. Now, each of these happens on account of some defect of order. Remember, he talked a couple of days ago about the order that is established, okay, the order of ourselves, our fellow man, and also to God, by reason of the lower powers not being checked by the higher. Because the sudden rising of a movement of the sensuality is in us due to the sensuality not being perfectly subject to reason, and the sudden rising of a movement of reason itself is due in us to the fact that the execution of the act of reason is not subject to the act of deliberation. So he's saying that the reason we would maybe commit what would otherwise be a mortal sin, violently, like we kill somebody, but it was an act of passion and we never had a chance to deliberate it, or else there's an inordinateness between our reason and our bodies. Those were both safeguarded by original sin, so Adam and Eve would not have had those issues. Okay, so he's going to say that they only could sin mortally, and they didn't have the capability of sinning only venially like we do, right? But that was lost by original sin. Article 4, whether a good or wicked angel can sin venially. Isn't that interesting? Can angels sin venially? He's going to say, no, they can't. An angel's intellect is not discursive. It does not proceed from principles to conclusions so as to understand both separately as we do. Consequently, whenever the angelic intellect considers a conclusion, it must of necessity consider it in its principles. Now, in matters of appetite, ends are like principles, while the means are like conclusions. Wherefore, an angel's mind is not directed to the means, except as they stand under the order to the end. Consequently, from their very nature, they can have no inordinateness in respect of the means, unless at the same time they have an inordinateness in respect of the end. Okay, so we can kind of like halfway sin. We can have a sin according to the means, but not to the end, and that would be venial sin. But with angels, it's like all or nothing. And he's going to go on and say, it doesn't matter if it's a good angel or a bad angel. There is not, even bad angels, when they sin, they go all out. It's a mortal sin every single time, is what he is going to conclude, because of the nature of how their minds differ from us. And plus, they don't have bodies, and so they can't be tempted into lust or overeating and that kind of thing, which are probably most of the times when we sin more venially, it's those kind of things, right? Whether the first movements of the sensuality of unbelievers are mortal sin. Okay, so what if somebody isn't a believer? Maybe somebody hasn't been baptized. He's saying, is the first, temptation a mortal sin? Because they don't have that grace that we have of, baptism or confirmation or, that kind of thing. He says it's unreasonable to say that the first movements of unbelievers are mortal sins when they do not consent to them. This is evident for two reasons. First, because the sensuality itself could not be the subject of mortal sin, as stated above, right? It has to be the will. Now, the sensuality has the same nature in unbelievers as in believers. Therefore, it's not possible for the mere movement of the sensuality in unbelievers to be mortal sins. Secondly, from the state of the sinner, because excellence of the person or of the person never diminishes sin, but on the opposite, increases it. Therefore, a sin is not less grievous in a believer than an unbeliever, but more so. So rather than saying it's more grievous in an unbeliever, he's saying, hey, listen, we believers have more grace, more sacraments, more accessibility and use of the sacraments. There's more. It's worse for us if we sin venially. For the sin of an unbeliever are more deserving of forgiveness on account of their ignorance, whereas the sins of believers are more grievous on account of the sacraments of grace. Okay, so we don't have that excuse. Article 6, whether venial sin can be in anyone with original sin only. Okay, so let's just say this little girl has not been baptized. Okay, so she still has original sin. She's maybe 2 or so. I don't know how old she is. But and she's not of the age of reason yet, clearly. And so can she sin venially? This is interesting. It's impossible for venial sin to be in anyone with original sin alone and without mortal sin. The reason for this is because before a man comes to the age of discretion, the lack of years hinders the use of reason and excuses him from mortal sin. Wherefore, much more does it excuse him from venial sin, if he does anything which is such generically. But when he begins to have the use of reason, he is not entirely excused from the guilt of venial or mortal sin. Now, the first thing that occurs to a man to think about then is to deliberate about himself. And if he then direct himself to the due end, he will, by means of grace, receive the remission of original sin. Okay, so through baptism. Whereas if he does not then direct himself to the due end, and as far as he is capable of discretion at that particular age, he will sin mortally, or through not doing that which is in his power to do. Accordingly, thenceforth there cannot be venial sin in him without mortal, unless afterwards all sin shall have been remitted to him through grace. Okay, that's a little bit confusing, that last part of it, but I think the bottom line is a child cannot sin venially because they have not reached the age of reason, and even venial sins have to have a cooperation in the will to assent to it. So if I'm drawn to food, that's good. If I'm drawn to sex, that's good. But if I'm drawn inordinately and I allow my reason and my will to let go of my passions, well, then it's going to become a venial sin. And if I go to such a degree that it cuts off the immutable good God, and I block that grace, block that charity, then it's a mortal sin, and that's not good. All right, that'll do it for question 89 of Prima Secunda, and that's also complete this treatise on evil habits. Thank you for joining me, and we will tomorrow begin the treatise on law, which is really interesting. God bless you.